I'd known my friend's dad for years. He was always polite, respectful, the kind of man who carried himself with an easy confidence that was hard not to notice. I'd never given it much thought until recently. I'd gone over to their place to grab something I'd left the last time we hung out. My friend had said she'd be there, but when I knocked, her dad opened the door, saying she'd stepped out for a while. I thought about leaving and coming back later, but he insisted I come in and wait. We made small talk, his relaxed, friendly tone making it easy to settle in. As we chatted, I found myself noticing things about him I hadn't before. His smile was warm, his laugh genuine, and he had this way of making you feel like you were the only person in the room when he spoke to you. There was something undeniably intriguing about him. While we were talking, he casually mentioned he'd been working on a project in the garage, a little woodworking piece he was fixing up. He offered to show it to me, and, curious, I agreed. I wasn't really into woodworking, but the idea of seeing this different side of him made me want to know more. The garage was dim and cluttered, filled with the smell of sawdust and oil. Tools lined the walls, and various pieces of wood lay scattered around. He walked over to his workbench, picking up a piece of wood with a faint smile, explaining what he was working on. I listened, nodding along, but I wasn't really paying attention to the project. I was watching him, how his hands moved, the small details in his expression as he spoke. At one point, he glanced over and caught me staring. I looked away quickly, feeling a sudden rush of warmth in my cheeks. But instead of looking away, he just smiled, a bit more knowingly this time. There was a slight pause, just a heartbeat of silence, but in that moment, I felt the air shift between us. As he showed me some of his tools, our hands brushed a few times, subtle but enough to make me notice. Each time, I felt a small thrill run through me, something that both excited and unsettled me. I couldn't deny the pull, the way my curiosity about him seemed to be growing into something I didn't expect. I kept telling myself it was harmless. He was just being nice, I was just being polite, but my pulse quickened every time he looked my way. Part of me felt guilty even thinking about him like that. He was my friend's dad, after all. But there was something about him that made it hard to resist. He wasn't just a dad in that moment. He was a man with stories, talents, a hidden charm that was drawing me in. When he asked if I wanted to try sanding a piece of wood, I agreed. He showed me how to hold it, his hands guiding mine for a moment, his touch warm and steady. I felt my heart racing, and I could tell by his lingering glance that he sensed it too. I could have pulled my hands away, made an excuse to leave, but I stayed, drawn to this quiet connection forming between us. As I took in the garage around me, the closeness between us grew more intense. It was just the two of us in this quiet, tucked-away space, and I could feel the subtle tension lingering in the air. He'd step closer now and then, showing me how to use a tool or explaining something about his project, and every time he did, I could feel the warmth of his presence, the slight brush of his arm against mine. It was impossible to ignore. At one point, he leaned over to show me how to smooth the wood's edges. Our hands met again, and this time, neither of us pulled away immediately. There was a beat of silence, a shared glance, as if each of us was trying to gauge what the other was thinking. I felt my breath catch, but I didn't move. It was like there was an unspoken agreement that we didn't need to acknowledge. Just the quiet understanding that something was there, even if we both knew it probably shouldn't be. Every small gesture felt charged, like a silent invitation that was left hanging in the air. He didn't say much, and neither did I, but I could feel it in his gaze, in the way his voice softened a bit when he spoke to me. There was an electricity between us, unspoken but undeniably present. I found myself drawn to his calm, confident presence, the quiet steadiness that made it hard to look away. He reached over my shoulder to grab a tool from the shelf behind me, and for a brief moment, I felt his chest against my back. The warmth of him was overwhelming, my heart racing in a way I couldn't control. I bit my lip, wondering if he could feel it too, this intense awareness that seemed to fill the space between us. The sound of his breathing, the closeness of him, it was all I could focus on. I tried to keep things light, to make small talk that felt safe, but every time he responded, his tone was deeper, softer, almost as if he was aware of the same tension I was. It was as though we were both tiptoeing around the edge of something, neither of us ready to make the first move, but neither willing to step back, either. The room felt smaller, the walls closer. My friend's dad was no longer just the friendly, familiar figure I'd known for years. He was something different now, a man whose presence I felt with every breath, every subtle glance he gave me. There was something magnetic about him, a pull I couldn't seem to resist, even though I knew I should. When he looked at me, I felt like he was seeing right through me, like he knew exactly what was running through my mind. I couldn't remember the last time I'd felt this alive, this caught off guard by someone's presence. I knew it was dangerous, that the line we were treading was thin, but in that moment I didn't care. The sound of his voice brought me back as he continued to explain the project, his words barely registering as I stood there, caught up in the moment. I couldn't ignore the subtle touches, the way our hands met just a second too long, or the way his gaze lingered on mine when I looked up. It felt like every move was intentional, like he was testing the waters just as much as I was. This wasn't just about curiosity anymore. It was about a connection that went beyond words, something that seemed to spark between us in a way I'd never experienced before. The thrill, the quiet rush of knowing something was happening that neither of us wanted to stop. It was exhilarating, and I wasn't ready to let it go. As I stood there, I realized he was closer than before, our shoulders nearly brushing as he worked on the project. I could feel his warmth beside me, and it was as if every small movement brought us a little closer, each one making my heart pound a bit harder. He leaned in to show me something on the workbench, and for a second, our faces were just inches apart. I held my breath, feeling the intensity of his gaze on me, the soft tension building with each passing moment. Our eyes met, and it felt like he was searching for something, a sign that he wasn't the only one feeling this spark. He didn't look away, and neither did I. It was like we both knew that this moment was different, that something between us had shifted beyond the usual. My heart was racing, and I wondered if he could tell, if he could feel the same rush of excitement mixed with uncertainty. He let out a breath, almost like he was about to say something, but instead, he just smiled. A small, knowing smile that made my pulse quicken even more. There was no need for words. The silence between us said enough. It was charged, filled with things left unsaid, with feelings we both seemed to understand but wouldn't dare speak aloud. In that quiet moment, it was like an unspoken agreement passed between us, a mutual recognition of what was happening. He looked away, breaking the eye contact, but the impact of that look lingered. My mind was racing, caught between the thrill of the moment and the line we both knew we were skirting. I tried to remind myself of all the reasons why this was wrong, why I should step back, but the more I thought about it, the less I wanted to leave. There was something magnetic pulling me to stay, something that felt so wrong but so undeniably right at the same time. A part of me wanted to break the tension, to say something casual and move past the intensity, but another part wanted to savor it, to let it linger just a bit longer. I could feel the weight of his gaze on me even when he wasn't looking directly at me, the quiet anticipation that seemed to hang in the air around us. It was a moment suspended in time, one that felt too fragile to disturb. Then, almost as if he'd read my mind, he turned to me again, his expression softer, more serious. His hand brushed mine, just barely, but the touch sent a shiver down my spine. It was such a small gesture, but it held so much meaning, like a quiet confirmation of everything I'd been feeling. I could tell he was as aware of it as I was, and that awareness made it feel even more real, even more powerful. He cleared his throat, his voice a little lower, a little more uncertain than before. I could tell he was searching for the right words, trying to keep things controlled. It was like we were both standing at the edge, just waiting to see who would be the first to step back, or take that final step forward. The tension between us was undeniable, and neither of us seemed ready to end it. With a small, almost reluctant smile, he stepped back, putting just a bit of distance between us, but the look he gave me said enough. There was something there, something he wasn't going to deny, even if neither of us would act on it in that moment. It was as if we'd crossed an invisible line, one that couldn't be undone but didn't need to be pushed further just yet. As we exchanged one last look, I knew this moment would stay with me. Even if nothing more ever happened, Even if we never acknowledged it again, there was a connection between us now, one that had been silently agreed upon and shared in those few minutes. It was exhilarating and terrifying, and as I turned to leave, I couldn't shake the feeling that something between us had changed forever. Leaving the garage, I felt the cool air hit my face, but it did nothing to calm the rush of emotions inside me. My mind was spinning, replaying every moment of what had just happened. The intensity of it, the unspoken understanding we'd shared, it lingered, filling me with a mix of excitement and guilt that I couldn't shake. I kept asking myself if I'd imagined it all, if maybe I'd misread his actions, but deep down, I knew I hadn't. The tension had been real, and both of us had felt it. As I walked to my car, I tried to clear my head, reminding myself that he was my friend's dad, that nothing like this could ever happen. But the memory of his gaze, the feel of his hand brushing against mine, kept pulling me back. It was like an invisible thread connecting us, a quiet longing that refused to fade. I couldn't believe how drawn I was to him, how something so small had stirred up feelings I didn't even know I had. I sat in the car, gripping the steering wheel, trying to steady my breathing. The logical side of me kept telling myself to let it go, that it was just a fleeting moment, an intense but passing attraction. But the way he'd looked at me, the warmth in his eyes, it didn't feel like something I could just brush off. I'd never felt this way before, and the thrill of it was as confusing as it was intoxicating. The more I thought about it, the more I felt a pang of guilt creeping in. This was my friend's father, a man who was supposed to be off-limits, someone I should only ever see as an authority figure, a familiar face in a friendly home. I knew I should focus on that, on all the reasons this was wrong. But even as I tried to convince myself, my mind kept drifting back to the possibility of something more, to the thought of what could happen if we ever crossed that line. In the days that followed, I found myself replaying the memory over and over, caught between the thrill of it and the reality I knew I had to face. I kept wondering if he was thinking about it too, if he felt the same tension lingering between us. It was a dangerous fantasy, one that I knew I shouldn't entertain, but I couldn't help myself. There was something about the secrecy of it, the thrill of knowing something we shared would never be spoken aloud. Every time I saw him after that, there was a brief, unspoken acknowledgement in our eyes, a hint of that shared moment we both knew had happened but would never discuss. It was as if we'd entered a silent agreement to keep it locked away, something only the two of us understood. And though I knew it would never go any further, part of me didn't want to let it go, didn't want to lose that small, secret thrill. As much as I tried to move on, I couldn't shake the feeling that something between us had changed. It wasn't anything visible, nothing anyone else would notice, but it was there. A quiet understanding, a connection that neither of us could deny. It was a line we hadn't crossed but had come close enough to feel, close enough to know that if things were different, if circumstances allowed, there might have been something more. In the end, I knew I had to let it be, to leave that moment in the past where it belonged. But even as I told myself that, I couldn't help but wonder what it would be like to take things further, to explore that connection instead of keeping it hidden away. It was a question that would stay with me, a small, forbidden thrill that would linger, something I'd carry in the back of my mind, just out of reach, but never completely gone.